Welcome to WLNM, the web novel and manga review, hosted by Zeke Changuris.
Welcome to WLNM, the web light novel and manga review, the podcast dedicated to bringing our listeners the artists and writers that are part of this renaissance of creativity, giving us stories to entertain and inspire us. We have something different today for you. We sit down with one of those unsung heroes of the manga and light novel community, Japanese to English localization specialist, Katrina Leonoudakis. Yes. So welcome, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
No, thank you for having me. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, so let's get right into it.
Sure.
Why? I mean, this is one of those.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I mean, I fell into my first career. So I kind of fell into journalism. So were you like from an early age? Yeah, I want to learn to read another language and then translate it for other people.
Oh man, absolutely not. I think my earliest career goal was I wanted to be a veterinarian. And then when I realized I wouldn't get to work with only cats, I decided I would be a brain surgeon. And then it just went downhill from there. I didn't actually consider translation a career opportunity until probably halfway through college. But by that time, I had already been fan translating stuff for about 6 or 7 years.
Okay, so so when did you start immersing yourself in the language?
So I think like a lot of young translators, I got into it right at the beginning, Toonami, you got your Dragon Ball Z, you got your Sailor Moon. I got really into that whole anime thing as a kid, worked out way into a teenager. And then as a teenager, there's so many things that I wanted to read and get into, but back in the kind of early to mid 2000s, availability wasn't that good in terms of trying to get your hands on officially translated manga. Or this is back in the day when they're releasing anime like 2 episodes at a time on DVD. You have to go down to Best Buy and see if it was out yet.
Yeah.
So for me, I really got into go online and be like, oh hey, someone scanned in the Japanese version that just came out last week. I know 3 kanji and all the hiragana. Let's see what I can make of it. And it was kind of from there that I was like, oh well, it's hard, but there's some rules. Like it's kind of like math. I could just follow it. And then from there, I just kind of tumbled down into, picking up some Japanese books and learning the language. And, the more that I translated kind of online, just like for this fan stuff, or just like people randomly commenting on like my live journal post being like, hey, I found this random thing. Can you translate this for me? I'd have to look up half the things, but the more you look something up, it started to slowly get into my brain to the point where I'm like, okay, maybe I should double major in this now instead of just, doing this major. So that kind of led me down I don't want to say dark path, but definitely led me down that way.
Well, I mean, like we all turn our lives, find our place somewhere, and sometimes it's not where we expect it. But it's fun to hear that your story, that you started out learning this stuff a lot because I guess necessity is the mother of invention in this case. You wanted to learn this because you wanted to have access to things that you couldn't get. And so you took it upon yourself to figure it out. And that's a lot more effort than a lot of people go through for anything.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a part of it too where, fan translation being what it is, despite, the whole debate behind it, I think a lot of it for me was, I was able to provide something that other people kind of needed. So it's definitely a little bit of that, people come to me when they want this really obscure author's information or whatnot. And even if it was just 5 people, it meant a lot to me as like a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old sitting behind a crummy laptop screen where there's like 4 people around the world who are kind of depending on you. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that the internet created, but it was something that really fueled me and made me feel really fulfilled to be doing something for someone else that in a way only I could do.
Well, what was the first thing that you truly think you made a good translation for?
Oh God.
For either fans or what do you think?
Something that was good? Oh my gosh. Well, it's hard because I feel like my standards for good have changed over the last 10, 15 years. Definitely looking back at some of the early stuff I did was not very good at all. I would say probably when I got like midway through college, maybe about 5 or 6 years into like fan translating, was when I started feeling like, okay, I think I did a good job on that. And I can look back at some of those now and go, okay, wasn't too bad. It was like, I think it was just like a seinen manga. I don't want to go too in depth because I
Yeah, that's
haven't
fine.
linked my online persona to my real life one, but I think it was definitely some sort of seinen manga.
Yeah, well, considering I came from the early days where we were swapping VHS cassettes, uh,
Like the
you
big
know,
printouts
yes,
of
I
subtitles.
am. I'm very. I'm thankful for anyone who would go through the effort of subbing something for nothing. So,
Hmm.
th- thank you. Even though you started, after I had a full-time career, thank you very much. Um, so, what do you think the biggest challenge as a localization specialist or a translator? Uh, when it comes to translating manga or anime? What do you think the largest challenge that you face when doing that?
That's a good question. And I have two answers.
Okay.
The first is linguistic, and I think it's really comes down to culture. Um, and one of the issue with that is, if you've got a book or something, you don't have images to go with it. So if there is something super obscure and cultural, and you're localizing this for like a children's book or something, you can go ahead and change that for the locale that you're translating it for. That's kind of like what everybody points to is the Pokemon Jelly Donut thing. Um, if they hadn't been images, if they had just been a children's book, it would have been super easy and nobody would have noticed the issue. But therein lies the issue when you're getting into graphic media, like a comic book or a manga, or you're looking at anime or a TV show, is that, when you have something like, for example, a pun, and they show an image of the pun, kind of like, oh, I'm going to use for example, in Tokyo, the subway card is called suika, which also means it means watermelon. So there's a couple different manga and anime that will say like, oh, I need to go get my suika, and everyone's like, why do you need a watermelon? They'll show a watermelon on screen, but it does not work in pretty much any other language. Is you don't make the connection between something that's like a sui card and
Yes.
a watermelon are two very linguistically different words. So you can't change obviously what's on screen, like unless you're 4 kids and going in and editing out all the different guns into water guns. So you really have to kind of play around with, okay, what can I do to make that work? Um, can I make it work? Do I have to put a translator's note in? Like how can I change this around so that someone watching doesn't have to pull out a dictionary or like be completely drawn out of the moment? So definitely with any kind of visual media that's being translated, that's always a concern. And then the second biggest issue that I find with localization, and this is something that I've only been picking up on more recently, is kind of the limitations of the media itself. So for example, I work full time at Sega on top of freelancing for manga and anime. And one of the biggest issues we run into when we're localizing games is there's only so much text that can fit in a text box, or so much text that can fit in like a confirmation button. And in Japanese, you can pack a lot of meaning into very few kind of Unicode characters. So if you wanted to say something like confirm, you could use kette, which is like 2 characters, but confirm is 6. So if you've got a really, really tiny button to fit that kette in, now you have to say like, okay, do I put an okay with just an okay? Now I have to revise all of my standards. Are we going to be using only okay without okay for the entire game? And that's just one kind of instance. And you can extrapolate that out into manga. Like there's only so much text that can fit in the bubble, especially those very, very tall, very, very thin ones that you'll see a lot in manga. Horizontal languages like, English don't fit too well
Yes.
into those. So
Yes.
you can't pack too much into it. So while you're translating, you have to think, okay, I'd love to put a whole sentence in there, but how do I kind of shrink that down in terms of words to make it fit, but also still communicate the same meaning? So I think, and I don't think that's something a lot of people think about, is just how much effort goes into making sure you're staying within the constraints of the text bubble of the box in the game. Or for subtitles, usually I get 40 characters per line in 2 lines. So that's 80 characters per line of dialogue that I can put in. And some of these lines of dialogue, they have to be on screen for at least a second. They can't be on screen for more than 7 seconds because of the standards of different companies. So it's really about figuring out how do you fit all the information they just spat out at you into that constraint and make it not only informative but entertaining.
Yeah,
So
well, it's kind of like my wife is in social media. She's been using Twitter since Twitter was a
mm,
thing, and she is an expert at like deconstructing ideas into 140 characters. That is like one of her strong suits. You can give her a concept and she's like, okay, and then turn it into 140 characters. Now with, and even now with 280, she's just like, she always comes in under because she still thinks in that 140 character.
mhm,
Though I found this interesting. I've been reading Noragami, and they
mhm,
put translation notes at the end of each of the manga,
mhm,
and I love how uh, it says, on page 1 in English, Hiyori has just repeated the word no 3 times. Varying punctuation shows the progression of her feelings, but it bears pointing out that the original Japanese, she used 2 different words. The first word expressions were masaka, which is an expression of disbelief or strong hope that something is not true, as it is often translated as no, it can be, or don't tell me. The final and more emphatic expression is yeah, which means no in a sense of rejection, as in no, that is something I don't want, something I don't want, which
mhm.
then, I love that they do that, because then I go back to page 71 and read, you know, how she said, and reread that scene, and it puts it into a much more interesting context at times.
Mhm.
And I can appreciate how there are challenges there. And like all, I guess, anime watchers, especially one who has been watching as long as I have, um, we of course have picked up a little bit. And I have actually studied for 2 years trying to learn and bits and pieces of Japanese, doing going to the Carnegie Library and taking a class there.
Mhm.
So but I still don't even know enough to be dangerous. But there are times where I'm like, why did they put like the character will be referring to, she will definitely say like Oni-chan, but the subtitler will put the name
Mhm.
of the character instead of what, if you watch anime at all, that is referring to like Big Brother. So
Mhm.
do you know why decisions like that are made sometimes?
Oh, absolutely. And I would probably do the same thing
Okay.
in that case. Um, I think, and this is a big discussion that I could go into a very long time for. I'm not going to go.
Okay.
So it comes down to cultural differences, and kind of what the meaning they're trying to express is.
Okay.
I feel like especially some people condescendingly call it like the very weeby weebs, but I think you're right. Like these are anime watchers have picked it up over the years, and previously when you're looking at stuff like fan translation or whatnot, you're looking at this history of translation where some of these very Japanese words were just left in. Um, and it wasn't for any real reason. It was just because, oh, we don't have a direct equivalent to that in English and I don't want to change it. So just learn the words.
Okay.
Um, but when you're looking at, and of course, like translation theory does evolve and change over the years. But for the last 50 to 60 years, the kind of, I feel like the predominant approach to translation has been, especially in media, kind of, you're looking at more cultural adaptation. So, if I'm sitting down with my mom or dad, I should be able to watch something like Great Pretender with them without them having to pause every few seconds and be like, okay, what does he mean by Sama? What does he mean by Oni-chan? Like,
Okay.
what is itadakimasu? So I think there's this history in the anime fandom of, okay, well, we've left these words as Japanese for this long. Why should we do anything different? And that comes back to kind of translation theory, in that, when you're experiencing something either through a dub or a sub, your experience should be interrupted as little as possible. So we call it equivalent experience in translation theory. So that means basically whatever translation or localization that you're doing of some sort of foreign property, the target audience should, in the target language, should have as near to an equivalent experience as the source audience in the source language as possible. And sometimes that means changing things up so you do have a more American joke instead of a Japanese joke, or skipping over honorifics because those aren't just something we do in American English.
Kind of like, so it
Go
doesn't
ahead.
interrupt the suspension of disbelief in a way, kind of like how
Yeah, kind of.
in theater you do your best to not interrupt that idea, not break that fourth wall, to let the person immerse themselves in the visual and auditory aspects of theater.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. So for your example specifically, with in Japan, it's typical to refer to an older sibling, even if they're your twin brother who was born 5 minutes before you. It's typical for them to use oni-chan or like oni-san or some form of brother with an honorific. We don't do that here at least in the United States. I feel like there are some smaller kind of subcultures where they will call their older brother like, hey bro, like, hey brother, can you come help me out? But we don't have the same kind of cultural connotations. I would even go to say that if I'm calling someone, hey bro, come over here, I'm not thinking they're actually brothers, I'm thinking they're friends.
Right.
So it's all about that kind of cultural adaptation. So, if I'm translating something for a Western, predominantly American audience, then I am going to be changing stuff like Oni-chan to whatever the person's name is, because that's how that person would refer to their brother if they were in this kind of cultural context of Western American culture.
Okay.
Now, sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
There are different translation theorists that kind of don't agree with this. I think there's one, I forgot what his name is. There's one German translation theorist who talked about foreignization, saying like, it's a disservice to the audience to kind of muddle that, to make them have that equivalent experience. Like, you should be preserving certain cultural things, and people should be aware that they are reading a translation and kind of honoring that fact. Kind of in the same way that, like, if you're in the theater, you should kind of acknowledge that, yes, there is lighting going on. There is this music that's happening, that they're singing, but it's not really happening in universe. This is kind of suspending your suspension of disbelief a little bit. But yeah, there's a lot of debate about it. And I personally subscribe to more of you should provide that equivalent experience, especially when it comes to kind of this subculture of anime watchers who are really accustomed to having everything in. It's, I hate to be the bad guy sometimes. And I'm like, no, we're not doing that anymore, guys. Come on. Let's get into the 21st century. Come on, guys. So.
Well, and this is, I guess, in a cultural side topic in a way. But two things, like you were saying, as far as relations go, it's kind of like in Greece or Greek, everyone's a cousin. Like I was saying, my father's cousin is my uncle, but everyone else, it doesn't matter whether they're third or fourth or whatever, they're just a cousin. And but as you were saying with honorifics, linguistically, I have found, because I grew up in like the edges of Appalachia, we still, when I was growing up, you would use Miss or Mr. before you referenced an adult. And in many cases, the person you were with, you used their full name. And it was Miss Violet, or Ms. or you use the Miss Sandy. You use honor, like you use Miss or Miss or Mrs. and their first name. And same with, it was Mr. Tom, things like that. And I noticed a strange, parallel between some of the, for lack of a better term, that we had honorifics in this very small subculture of Eastern Appalachia, where you referred to people in this overly polite manner that hadn't quite changed with the modern era. It's just one of those fascinating quirks that I found and quickly and kind of identified, because I'm like, yeah, well, we used to be like, yes, refer to people with their full names, or be Miss or Ms. All the time. You wouldn't think of addressing an adult without saying Mr. or Miss. Just you wouldn't. But so what, I mean, what, well, I'm trying to decide. It's probably an hornet's nest to go into what I would call, some would call a disaster of localization. Because
Okay.
I find that word can be loaded in some ways, because there are people who are like, well, localization, like you were saying with the rice cake
Hmm.
versus jelly donut, or
Hmm.
the absolute strangest localization or worst localization, in my opinion, is Macross turns into Robotech. And
Hmm.
it's a completely different animal than what
Hmm.
originally was. And it seems to have for some people, the term localization tends to come like loaded, because it means, well, you're changing the context of what's happening. And that's what I hear when I'm talking to, I mean, don't talk to as many as I do when we do have conventions, but when we have conventions, uh, you talk to them, and they're some very staunch, almost militant persons who are like, no, you have to, it's got to be direct. It's got to be, this is what they were saying in their cultural context. Because if you don't do
Hmm.
that, it means you're stripping away their cultural identity. Like, okay. I mean, it is, like I said, I found it to be a loaded way of, for some
Hmm.
people, is they're like, well, localization means stripping away what it is. I mean,
Hmm.
and I think the way you put it, you're just trying to reduce the barriers for entry for the
Hmm.
story.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out, kind of like you said, that it's depending on who you talk to, it can mean different things. Because in the realm of translation theory, it's a very well-defined word. But when you're looking at some of the people who claim to be very against localization, they have a completely different definition of the word than you might
Right.
think. So it's difficult sometimes as a professional to interact with those people, because you're trying to explain what localization is, and then they try to define it on their end, and it's like, well, we're clearly talking about two different things. We need to get some sort of terminology going so we understand what's going on.
Right.
But they're very stubborn and very kind of clinging to their own definition. And it's a very interesting debate to have, because this is something that's been going on for millennia in translation theory, like as early as like Roman translations of Greek poetry, where people were arguing about whether or not they were localizing too much. This has been going on for years and years and years and years. Um,
You could
and I
say
think
that
it
about the gods and goddesses. Were
oh
they
yeah,
were they
well,
localized when they
yeah.
changed their names?
I mean, if you're looking at Rome stealing some of the Greek mythology, maybe. But I think the biggest, and while the anime debate's really big, you look at people arguing over translations of the Bible between like the year 500 and the year 1500, and it is absolute chaos. Like, people got executed for bad translations of the
Yes.
Bible. Like there was one church, I think, I forget who the translator was, but there was the Roman church, or not the Roman Catholic Church had a new translation commissioned of the Bible, and there was one pastor, I guess, somewhere in Italy that started using it, and the people rioted because they're like, "This is different. That's not what Luke 13:4 is. You're defacing the word of God." And they threw a riot. They're like burning houses down and stuff. Like, it was intense. But yeah, anyways, this is a debate that's been going on for a very long time, over whether or not you should quote unquote localize. And I think that, as controversial as it might be to say as a professional, I think some of these very strong-willed, very loud people about localization on the internet do sometimes have a point. Usually, the one or two kind of examples that they point to are examples of, something that was, it was a poor localization choice. Something like, the Dragon Maid incident gets pulled up a lot. Different political jokes that kind of made their way into dubs that people took offense about. And again, these aren't people who are going to watch the dubs. These are mostly people who are like, oh, dubs are bad because they're over localizing anyways. But the fact that they went too far, to the point where even professionals would probably agree, yeah, I wouldn't have done that. That's what they want to use as their kind of their backup. And again, you have to think, kind of, I mentioned earlier, there's this history of, under localization and poor translation in the anime and manga industry already, based off of those old fan translations where someone who maybe studied abroad for a semester in Japan translated a whole bunch of stuff. And that became the standard for a while, I guess, for that series. So you've got kind of combined with this history of kind of anti-official translation, saying like, oh, look what they've done to stuff like Macross, or look what they've done to stuff like Pokemon, or One Piece.
Or they're censoring it by changing things. That's the latest.
Yeah.
Is they're censoring it. That's the term.
Oh,
they're
yeah.
censoring it because they're changing things.
Yeah. And I mean, I look back because I started to get into anime back in the day when they really were censoring things, when anime was being brought over for children. You know, you got stuff like
Yes.
One Piece where they're taking out all the blood and they're physically editing the animation cells to be child friendly. Or stuff like one of the earliest anime I was really into was Cyborg 009. They did a reboot way back in the early 2000s that was on Toonami. And I remember getting so excited to get the uncut DVD version. They only released one DVD and it had first 8 episodes. They did not release anymore. But the uncut version was literally, they just had a scene of like a guy getting stabbed and falling over. And I was like, that's it? Like, oh, I guess they can't put that on Cartoon Network, but like, that's it? That's all they took out kind of thing. So there was a time when they really were censoring everything. But now that anime is becoming a lot more mainstream and is being targeted more towards young adults, they aren't going in and changing anything. If anything, the only place that really is doing that is broadcasting stations in Japan will literally only show a censored version of something that's very graphic or usually sexual in nature.
Well, you've got to save, do that and then save the other ones so you can have the DVD sales.
Yeah, buy the Blu-rays, guys.
Buy the Blu-rays. That's how you're going to get, I mean, that's how you're going to get more anime made and how you're going to see the goods.
Buy the Blu-rays, get the whales to buy the Blu-rays. Yeah, so I think the claims of censorship when it comes to localization are blown grossly out of proportion.
Okay.
I would say the only time I've ever encountered any form of censorship in my translations career is when I was working on interspecies reviewers.
Those of us who watched it enjoyed the hell out of it.
Oh my God, I loved working on that show. It was fantastic. And I'll tell you right now, like everyone at Funimation who was on that show loved it. We had so much fun with it. And I was not in the loop for what happened behind the scenes. I was just told we are no longer continuing on with this. But I have a hunch that it was probably something to do, with, an episode being hosted on Apple or something like that. And they're going, okay, we've got like someone who looks like underage person, like violating someone when they're saying, please stop. Maybe we don't want this on our platform. So I can completely understand where that came from. And that did result in us ending up going through Australia to finish up the series. But I mean, you also look at Japan, like 8 out of 9 TV stations showing it in Japan took it off because it was too bad. Like, this is not a case of, the liberal Western media censoring stuff. This is just, they went a little bit too far.
Everyone thought they went too far, which is fine. There's a place,
which is fine.
But there's a place for that too. There's a place for those programs, and you can find them. And
exactly.
It just, you're not going to put everything on broadcast television. That's just the way the world works.
Basically. But yeah, in terms of censorship, when these people are talking, it's really nothing to do with that. And again, most of the examples they point out are stuff that came out years ago that most, if not all, professionals go, no, that you're right, those are bad, but this is different. So it's an interesting conversation. Go ahead.
So you had a lot of fun on interspecies reviewers.
Oh yes.
What other shows have you really enjoyed? I mean, I personally, as far as a viewer goes, I freaking loved Oh Maidens in Your Savage Season.
Oh, I'm so glad you did.
That
was one of my favorites. Oh, and I think Oh Maidens in the Savage Season, I feel like was one of the first translations where I kind of went a little wild. I was like, I think I can get away with some stuff on this. Like, let's push the boundary. Like, if I was given free rein to translate something, let's go. And it ended up coming out really nice. So I'm really glad that it did. And of course, the series itself was really well written. I mean, Murokata is amazing. So that was super fun to work on. Really enjoyed that. I've been on the last couple seasons and releases of Utano Prince Sama, which I was really into way back in like the early 2010s. So it's really cool to be working on that now. I really enjoyed working on Chihaya Furu. I did all of the home video releases for Sentai Filmworks.
And really how is that translating? I mean, that's poetry specific. Is that a whole nother challenge, isn't it?
It is. Well, actually, when we did the Sentai release, we actually hired, I think, Alan Covert to do the poem translation. And when he did the poem translation, he actually translated these, because this is the Hyakuni issue. This has been translated hundreds and hundreds of times over the last however many years. And he actually did the poem translation so that they could work in English, at least the syllable structure. So the syllable structure is all the same. Unfortunately, the syllable structure might be the same, but it doesn't directly translate into kind of like the way the game strategy is done, which is all the stuff about like, oh, there's 5 different poems that start with chi. So we need to make sure that we listen for the second syllable on these. And those obviously don't work when you translate all these random poems completely differently. So it was interesting. And I know Crunchyroll, when they did the simulcast, ended up doing kind of their own translation for these poems that did actually adhere to the rules. For Sentais, we did something that was a little bit more syllabary, but we kept all of it in kind of like as in a song lyric. So I would do the Romaji and the English translation kind of on screen. Because sometimes they would talk both about, okay, they're saying chi ha, so now I can get the card. So you want to be able to show people, okay, they heard the chi, they heard the ha, because that's what the Japanese dub is saying. But then you also want them to understand the meaning behind the poem, because that also plays into kind of the overarching plot, you know, some of the historical lessons they're teaching, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a really interesting show to work on because of that. And even though I'm very much a person who's like, I think you should have kind of an equivalent experience, I don't think there's a way to localize this in a way where you could get away with something like no honorifics or no, you know, Japanese references whatsoever. You can't jelly donut Chihayafuru. It's not, it's just not
unique.
possible.
It's a uniquely Japanese game. When I tried to figure out a way to use that kind of game method to teach like English students, and I couldn't figure it out, but I thought it was a very clever idea. If maybe we could figure out how to do it with sonnets from Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's a really great kind of equivalent that you could do it with. I mean, if Shakespeare had 100 sonnets and a whole bunch of them all started with the same few words, you could totally make a game very similar out of it. But yeah, there's no real direct equivalent to it in English. But I think, and this is something that we think about when we're localizing stuff like anime or games or manga, is that, you know, if something is so intrinsically tied to the source culture, sometimes it's best not to localize it. So for example, like if I get to make all my own choices, I'm not influenced by the publishing company or whatnot. If I'm translating something that takes place in a Japanese school or like is a Chihayafuru, I will typically keep stuff like honorifics. I'll typically keep cultural references. I try to avoid any kind of translator's note, but I do want it to, you know, it's set in Japan. Sega has a specific kind of a similar approach when they're doing the Yakuza series, which is something I've worked on for the last few years with Sega. Scott Stricker, I guess, has in some interviews has described it as, you know, this is a Japanese game. You're in Japan. We don't want you to pretend like you're in New York now, like bashing bad guys. You're in Japan, you know, he's a Japanese guy. You're going to go do some Japanese things and you're going to like it, you know? And I think his approach to localization, you know, it's very entertaining. It's really snappy. The comedy is still there. There's a couple of things here and there that, you know, they have to add a couple extra lines, which they can do because it's a game. You're not constrained by like, you have 3 seconds now to say this line in ADR. So in the game, you can get away with a little bit more. But he really has kept that kind of Japanese flavor to the Yakuza games, and it's worked tremendously. Like Yakuza is bigger than ever now. So definitely when it comes to stuff like that, you know, you've got to keep the culture in there. You can't, I want to say, over localize. But conversely, and I'm sure as you realize how big isekai is right now, where everyone's getting sent to another world and the fantasy stuff is explode. I think next season we've got like 12 different isekai going on right now,
which is fine because it's a very, 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 very old genre. As I keep trying to remind people, Lewis Carroll wrote an isekai.
Oh my god, I hadn't realized that. Because I always use Inuyasha. I'm like, Inuyasha is an isekai, and people freak out about
Alice
that. But you're
in
right.
Wonderland is an isekai.
Oh god,
actually,
it's an isekai.
Morpheus descent, you know, the Ovid, you know, Morpheus going to the underworld in a way is, you could tie that to as almost as if it wasn't a isekai, because he goes to another land. So Alice in Wonderland is probably the most well-known isekai in the world.
Oh god.
Hence every
my whole life has changed.
Hence, every English girl in every anime is blonde-haired, wears a British tea-length style dress, and her name is Alice.
Your name is Alice. Yeah. But yeah, no, well, I've worked on quite a few isekai nowadays, both in manga and anime. And one of the first things I do is I get rid of honorifics. I get rid of a lot of that cultural stuff, because it's not going to exist. Like, you're not going to go into a D&D campaign in this high fantasy and be sawing and chawning everybody.
Yes,
because
exactly.
This isn't Japanese culture. So, and I've had a
Yeah.
couple people get a little upset about that. But then you also have stuff where you've got like the one like Japanese guy who dies and then like gets reincarnated into this world, and he is using sans on everything, and so is everyone else. But then it's like, okay, well, what do you do? Because like Nair has only lived in this fantasy world her entire life. Why would she be using san with this rando dude that just popped out of a portal? So it's kind of an interesting,
because the magic of the reincarnation is letting him translate these words from their language into his language, and so the magic is adding the honorifics even though he is not hearing the honorifics. See, I'm good at mental gymnastics.
There you go. No, you've got far better mental gymnastics than me, but no, it's kind of interesting. But yeah, that's definitely my rule of thumb: is if it's set in Japan and it's very Japanese, I'll keep it in. And if it's not set in Japan, it's like, no, get it out of here.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure to, we can't thank guests like you for enough for giving us manga and anime in a format we can read, and for taking the time to share your thoughts on this industry. And if you listeners like what you've heard and would like me to continue to share these conversations with artists, creators, and industry pros out there, please click the subscribe button. Until next time, keep reading.
This has been a WLNM podcast.